Hey there, anatomy and physiology students. So I just wanted to make a little video to kind of help. I know that this epithelial tissue stuff can be a little bit tricky, so I just wanted to try to help clarify some things. But as always, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, send me an email and ask, or phone a friend and help you make sure that you can know the differences between these different types of epithelial tissue. So just to kind of review, I just wanted to show a few pictures, and I did show these in class as well, but just to make sure that this information makes sense. So first off, just to kind of review the parts of a cell. So if you guys take a look at this picture on the screen, you should see that we've labeled some structures. So letter A is pointing to the outside of the cell, and if we could, we would actually put lines around all sides of this. But on the outside of a cell, these are cells that we find inside of our body, so that means that they would be animal cells, and so the outside would be the cell membrane. So in your notes, if you didn't already, please make sure that you kind of draw a cell and label the different components. So all around the edges, all the sides, that's the cell membrane, not the cell wall, because we're not talking plant cells, but with animal cells, letter A is pointing to the cell membrane, goes all the way around. Then if we take a look, I'm going to skip and go to letter C, you should see this dark circle in each of these cells. And if you think back to biology, hopefully you recall that this dark circle that we're going to see stained in all these cells is the nucleus. And then finally letter B is kind of pointing to what's in this space. Now we know that there would actually be organelles. We're not going to be able to zoom in enough to see all those organelles, but how we label that space would be letter B would be the cytoplasm. So that's within the cell membrane, in between the cell membrane, what's on the outside, and the nucleus. All that space is going to be filled in with the cytoplasm. So hopefully that makes sense. Then another picture I want you to take a look at, and I would also draw this with your notes, and feel free to pause this as you need to. But something that's really important to understand would be all these different surfaces that we take a look at. And so if we take a look at these different surfaces, letter A is pointing to this on the top. And what I was telling you guys in class is this is what's exposed. And so when we look at this underneath the microscope, we usually see white areas where you see basically air. There's no tissue there. And so whenever the surface of the cell that's exposed, we call that the apical or the free surface. So that's what this is. There's nothing attached to it, but because epithelial tissue covers and lines things, it's always going to have an exposed surface, and that's what we call the apical or the free surface. Letter B then is pointing to, it looks like the cell membrane again, but this is going to be what's on the side of the cells. And so we say the epithelial tissue, they're always tightly packed. And so they're touching the cells right next to them. And so this is what we call the lateral surface, just like when we talked about the directional terms and we said lateral is towards the sides. Well, that's what this is, the lateral surface. And then finally, letter C is pointing to basically what's on the bottom in this picture. Now, it isn't always on the bottom. The apical surface isn't always on the top, but sometimes we have to use our detective skills to figure out what's what. But letter C is pointing to what's on the bottom, and it's attached to, you can see this basic platform from the Legos, but this letter C is always attached to letter D. So letter D is going to be the basement membrane, and letter C is going to be the basal surface. So they both kind of sound like the bottom, basement, basal, so kind of think of it that way. The basal surface is the part of the epithelial tissue that's connected to the basement membrane. And then letter E, there's not really anything there, it's just a shadow. But when we look at this tissue, we see that there's always going to be connective tissue nearby. And so letter E is referring to the connective tissue that always has to be by the epithelial tissue, because remember, epithelial tissue is avascular. It doesn't have a blood supply, so it relies on that connective tissue nearby to get what it needs so that the cells can bring nutrients in and waste out so they can survive. So hopefully that makes sense with those different surfaces. Then the last two pictures that I wanted to show you basically take a look at the different types of epithelial tissue cells. And so one type of epithelial tissue, the first word that we use to describe them, are either simple or stratified. And both of those words refer to how many layers of cells there are. We say epithelial tissue can always be single, which is simple, or they can be multiple layers, which is stratified. And so if we look, this picture is showing 3 examples of simple epithelial tissue. Now, the second word that we use to name epithelial tissue is always based on the shape of those cells. And so all of these are simple epithelial tissue, but then there's 3 different shapes. So with these green Legos, you can see these cells look like they're flattened or squashed or tile-like or scale-like. And so if you remember from our word bites, we say that letter A, this is showing simple squamous, because squam means squashed, basically. So that's what this is. And it's simple again because it's only 1 layer. So we always say simple first and then the shape second. So simple squamous. Letter B, these look more like cubes. And so letter B, same thing. It's 1 layer of cells, so we call it simple. But then the second word, because they are cube-shaped, we call letter B simple cuboidal. Then finally, letter C, we have these tall, pillar-like columns. And so letter C, because it's only 1 layer, again, it's simple, but because the shape of the cell is columnar, we call letter C simple columnar. So one more time, simple squamous for A, simple cuboidal for B, and simple columnar for C. Then the other type that we have is we can have what's called pseudostratified, and if you remember from our word bites, pseudo means false, so pseudostratified or stratified. And this picture just isn't wanting to come up, so bear with me as I try to find it here, guys. Here it is. Maybe. Keeps on going to the different screen. Sorry. Okay, come on over. So when you take a look at this last one, if you look, these look like they could be or maybe are multiple layers. So letter A, if we look, we see that there are nuclei all over the place. So we maybe think, that's interesting. Maybe that's multiple layers. But upon closer examination, if you look, all of these are connected to that basement membrane. They don't all reach the apical surface, but they're all connected to the basement membrane. So this is what we call pseudostratified. And a couple of things with pseudostratified, as you're going to see with this lab, is that they're going to have 2 components that most of the others don't. One of those components are what we call goblet cells. Now I should have drawn some in here, but I'll show you with my pointer. The goblet cells are going to be towards the apical surface, and they're going to look even larger than a nucleus, and they're going to be usually really darkly colored. And those are goblet cells. And goblet cells secrete mucus, which is important because we have to keep this exposed surface moist. So that's the job of those goblet cells. And you'll see that they can be found lining our airways or lining our digestive system, to help to allow things to flow through our body, like food or air, things like that. And so hopefully that makes sense. Then the little knobs here on the Legos, pretend that those are actually all these little pieces of hair. And so those are called cilia. They're like little finger-like projections. And a lot of times they're going to work to try to trap things that aren't supposed to be there. So like in our trachea, we would find that there's all these little cilia, and they're going to try to grab onto those particles so they don't go into our lungs, for example. So that's a difference with those pseudostratified. Like I said, from afar it might look like it's several layers, but when we get to look closer, we see that they're all attached to the basement membranes. That's why we call it pseudostratified. And then because these are tall and column-like, we call this pseudostratified columnar. Letter B, if you look, we can see that there are multiple layers. And if you remember from your word bites, when there's multiple layers, we use the word stratified. So no longer are we saying simple or pseudostratified, but now we're going to call this stratified. And with stratified, you can see on this example that I made with the Legos that there's 3 different layers. So we say stratified for the first word, and then our second word we're going to take a look at the shape. And when we look at the shape of these cells, they all look like cubes. So we say that this is stratified cuboidal. Then finally on the bottom we have letter C, and you might be thinking, what in the world? There's so many layers. And sometimes in our body, you're going to find that there's a whole bunch of layers. And that's to help us so that we have what we need to stay protected and keep our cells. And so if we look at letter C, something you may notice is it's several layers. So once again, we're going to use that term stratified for the first descriptive word. And then we got to take a look and figure out the shape. If you look down towards this basement membrane, you'll see that these look cuboidal. But when we label the stratified cells, the stratified tissue, we're going to take a look at what's on the apical surface. So instead of being cube-shaped like they are as we get deeper in, we're going to look at the surface, and we see that these look like they are squashed. So this would actually be called stratified squamous, because we have to look at what's on the apical surface when we go to name the stratified tissue. We look at what's on the surface, what's exposed, and that gives us the clue as to how to name it properly. Hopefully that helped you understand some of the specifics with this epithelial tissue.